Racist hotel manager throws out black family, but when he discovers who they really are, Richard Thompson stood before the large wall mirror in his office at the Grand Manhattan Hotel, adjusting his tie with meticulous precision. The luxurious surroundings of the hotel were a reflection of his own inflated sense of self-importance. He wore a tailored suit, his hair slicked back, and his expression exuded an air of superiority. Richard had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, and he was determined to maintain the hotel's elite reputation at all costs. Another perfect day at the Grand, he mused, admiring his own reflection. A place where only the finest come to stay. His voice echoed slightly in the plush, carpeted room, filled with the faint scent of expensive cologne. He envisioned the guests that frequented the hotel, celebrities, dignitaries, and other affluent individuals, all of whom he believed deserved the utmost respect and service. Richard had a strict set of rules that he enforced with unwavering rigidity. He prided himself on his ability to maintain the hotel's standards, which he believed were paramount to its success. He often reminded his staff, "This isn't just a hotel, it's a sanctuary for the elite. We cannot afford to let anyone compromise that. Every guest must adhere to our policies or they simply don't belong here." His words were laced with a condescending tone, but they were met with nods of agreement from his subordinates, who were all too aware of his intolerance for deviation. As he straightened his tie for the final time, a knock on the door interrupted his reverie. It was Lisa, his assistant, with a clipboard in hand. "Richard, we have a new family checking in this afternoon." "The Johnsons," she announced, her tone professional yet cautious. Richard raised an eyebrow, feigning interest. "The Johnsons? What do we know about them?" Lisa glanced at her notes. "They're an African-American family, David and Michelle, along with their 2 children. They have a reservation for the weekend." Richard's expression soured slightly. "Right. I assume they're not exactly the usual clientele we cater to," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't help but let his prejudices seep into his thoughts. "Make sure they're aware of our policies upon check-in. We can't have any disruptions." "Of course, Richard," Lisa replied, sensing the tension in the air. "I'll ensure that everything is in order." As Lisa left the room, Richard resumed his inspection of his reflection, adjusting his cuffs as he pondered the day ahead. "They'll soon learn that this hotel is not a place for mediocrity," he thought, a smirk forming at the corners of his mouth. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, the Johnson family was making their way to the Grand Manhattan. David, a successful entrepreneur, held the door open for his wife Michelle, who was carrying their daughter Ava, who was 10, while their son Marcus, aged 12, walked alongside them, excitedly recounting their plans for the weekend. "I can't wait to see our room. I heard it has an amazing view of the city," Ava exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Just imagine the skyline at night with all those lights," Marcus added, his enthusiasm infectious. Michelle smiled at her children, feeling a wave of pride wash over her. "This is going to be a fantastic weekend, you guys. We've worked hard, and we deserve a little luxury, don't you think?" David nodded in agreement. "Absolutely. It's about time we took a break and enjoyed some family time together. Plus, it's a chance for you kids to experience something special." As they approached the grand entrance of the hotel, the imposing facade loomed above them, exuding an aura of wealth and exclusivity. The family stepped inside, welcomed by the opulent lobby adorned with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. "Wow, this place is incredible," Ava exclaimed, her voice filled with awe. Marcus looked around, taking in the lavish decor. "I can't believe we're actually here." David and Michelle exchanged proud smiles, sharing a moment of gratitude for the opportunity to provide their children with such experiences. However, their excitement was met with an indifferent gaze from Richard, who was observing their arrival from the front desk. He instantly sized them up, noting their attire and demeanor. Unlike the other guests he was accustomed to, the Johnsons did not fit his narrow definition of what he believed to be acceptable. As they approached the desk, Richard plastered on a forced smile, ready to mask his underlying disdain. "Welcome to the Grand Manhattan. How may I assist you today?" he said, his voice devoid of warmth. David stepped forward, extending his hand. "Hi, I'm David Johnson. We have a reservation for the weekend." Richard shook David's hand with a firm grip, his expression faltering for a moment. "Ah yes, Mr. Johnson, I see your reservation here. He glanced at the screen, his fingers tapping impatiently. "But I must say, we have a very specific clientele at this hotel." "Excuse me?" Michelle interjected, a hint of confusion in her voice. Richard continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "I just want to make sure you understand the importance of adhering to our policies. This establishment has certain standards that must be upheld." David, sensing the underlying tension, replied calmly, "We're here to enjoy a family getaway, and we assure you that we intend to respect the hotel's rules." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, I hope you do, because we cannot afford any disruptions. I trust you understand." Ava and Marcus exchanged glances, sensing the unease in the air. Michelle took a deep breath, trying to remain composed. "We appreciate your concern, but we're looking forward to a wonderful stay. We've heard great things about this hotel." Richard's smile remained plastered on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you do enjoy your stay, but remember, our policies are in place for a reason." "Of course," David replied, trying to maintain a diplomatic tone. "We understand completely." As they completed the check-in process, Richard's demeanor remained rigid, his prejudices festering beneath the surface. He watched the Johnsons with a mix of disdain and disbelief, convinced they did not belong in his world of luxury. The family took their room keys and headed toward the elevators, unaware of the storm that was brewing within Richard. As the doors closed behind them, he turned to one of his colleagues, an intern named Mark, who had been observing the interaction from a distance. "Mark," Richard said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "do you think they'll fit in here? I doubt they have the kind of class we typically cater to." Mark hesitated, unsure of how to respond. They seem like a nice family." Richard scoffed, shaking his head dismissively. "Nice doesn't cut it in this hotel. We need to maintain our standards." As he spoke, Richard felt a sense of satisfaction wash over him, convinced that he was protecting the hotel's elite reputation. Little did he know that the very actions he took to uphold those standards would soon lead to a reckoning that would challenge his prejudices and ultimately redefine his perspective on respect and humanity. In the heart of New York City, beneath the glimmering facade of wealth and privilege, the clash of ideals was only just beginning. The Johnsons were determined to enjoy their weekend, unaware of the prejudice that awaited them, while Richard's arrogance blinded him to the consequences of his actions, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change everything. As the Johnson family stood at the front desk of the luxurious hotel, a sense of unease began to settle over them. Richard Thompson, the hotel manager, had just finished sizing them up with a piercing gaze that seemed to strip away their dignity, leaving only the bare bones of their appearance. He stood behind the polished marble counter, his smile a tight mask of forced politeness that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Welcome to the Grand Lux Hotel," Richard said, his voice smooth but laced with an undercurrent of condescension. He glanced at their luggage, a collection of designer bags that hinted at wealth and status, yet in his mind, they were still out of place. "I trust you have your reservation." David Johnson stepped forward, a slight frown creasing his brow. "Yes, we do. Under the name Johnson for the weekend." Richard tapped at the keyboard, his fingers flying over the keys. As he searched for the reservation, he couldn't help but let a dismissive huff escape his lips. "I see. However, it appears that your stay is complicated. We have a strict policy regarding our clientele, you know." Michelle exchanged a glance with her husband, her expression a mix of confusion and indignation. "Excuse me, what do you mean by complicated?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with frustration. Richard straightened, a sense of superiority filling his chest. "I simply mean that our hotel maintains a certain standard of clientele," he replied, his tone dripping with implications that hung heavy in the air. "We cater to a specific demographic, and I'm not sure that—" "Wait a minute," David interjected, his voice firm as he leaned forward, refusing to let Richard's condescension push them around. "We are paying guests. We have every right to be here, and I assure you we fit your demographic just fine." Richard waved a dismissive hand, his eyes narrowing. "I'm afraid it's not just about payment. It's about the overall image we project, and frankly, I don't believe we can accommodate you without jeopardizing our reputation." David stepped back, hurt and disbelief flashing across his face. "What are you even talking about? We've come here to celebrate as a family. This is our first vacation in years, and we chose your hotel for its reputation." Richard leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms as if to physically distance himself from the Johnsons. "That's unfortunate, but I must insist. If you cannot adhere to our standards, I will have no choice but to cancel your reservation." Ava, their teenage daughter, shifted uncomfortably beside her brother Marcus, her eyes darting between her father and the manager. "Dad, maybe we should just—" she began, but David held up a hand to silence her, his resolve hardening. "No," he said, his voice rising slightly. "This is unacceptable. We deserve to be treated with respect, just like any other guest. You can't just dismiss us because of your prejudices." Richard's expression hardened, the tightness in his jaw betraying his irritation. "You misunderstand me. I'm looking out for the integrity of this establishment. It's not personal, it's business. We have policies for a reason." Michelle stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "What policies? You haven't cited a single one. This is about you and your biases, not about any actual rules." Richard scoffed, leaning forward slightly as if to assert his authority. "I don't have to justify my decisions to you. If you're going to make a scene, I'll have security escort you off the premises." The threat hung in the air, a palpable tension that made the lobby feel smaller. David glanced at his family, their faces a mix of hurt and disbelief. "You're serious?" he asked, incredulous. "You're going to kick us out for no reason?" Richard straightened up, his demeanor exuding a sense of triumph. "If I have to, I'm merely upholding the standards that our clientele expects. It's my job to ensure that this hotel remains a sanctuary for the elite." The Johnsons stood in stunned silence, grappling with the reality of the situation. They had traveled thousands of miles, their excitement now overshadowed by the harsh reality of Richard's prejudice. "Let's go, guys," David finally said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "We don't need this." As the family turned to leave, Richard couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. He had asserted his power, reinforced his beliefs, and sent a message that he would not tolerate those he deemed inferior. "Good choice," he called after them, a smug smile plastered across his face. "Enjoy your weekend elsewhere." Once they were out of sight, Richard turned to his colleague, Susan, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange from a distance. "Can you believe that?" he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Some people just don't understand their place." Susan frowned, crossing her arms as she leaned against the counter. "Richard, you can't seriously think that was okay. You treated them like they were less than human." "Less than human," Richard scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "They didn't belong here. This hotel is for a specific clientele, and they clearly don't fit the bill." "Maybe you should look in the mirror," Susan replied sharply. "You're letting your biases dictate how you treat people. This isn't just about the hotel's image, it's about basic decency." Richard rolled his eyes, but a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. "I'm doing what's best for the hotel. It's my responsibility to protect our reputation." "By kicking out paying guests based on their appearance?" Susan retorted, incredulous. "You might find that your precious reputation isn't worth much if this gets out." Richard waved her off, ignoring the gnawing feeling in his gut. "It won't get out, I'll make sure of that. Besides, we have plenty of other guests who appreciate the standards we uphold." Yet as the sun dipped below the skyline outside, casting long shadows across the lobby, Richard couldn't quite shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. He had won this battle, but there was a storm brewing on the horizon, one that would soon threaten the very foundations of his carefully constructed world. Meanwhile, the Johnsons stepped outside, their spirits crushed beneath the weight of Richard's disdain. "I can't believe this is happening," Michelle said, her voice thick with emotion. "We came here to celebrate, and now look at us." David placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his eyes scanning the bustling streets of New York. "We'll find another place. This isn't the end of our weekend." Ava, still reeling from the abrupt turn of events, looked up at her father. "But Dad, it's not just about the hotel, it's about how he treated us. We shouldn't let him win." Marcus nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we should do something. We can't just let him get away with this." David sighed, conflicted. "I understand how you feel, But let's not escalate things. We'll report this later, but for now, let's focus on finding a place that respects us." As they walked away from the hotel, the city loomed large around them, vibrant and alive, but the shadow of Richard's prejudice would linger long after they had left the Grand Lux behind. Little did Richard know, the repercussions of his actions were just beginning to unfold, and the Johnsons were far from finished. As the sun dipped below the skyline of New York City, casting long shadows across the opulent lobby of the Ritz Royale Hotel, Richard Thompson sat at his desk, anxiously scrolling through his phone. The notifications were relentless. Social media was ablaze with outrage over the Johnsons' ejection from the hotel. He could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on him as he read the comments, some supportive of the family, others condemning him and the hotel for their treatment of the distinguished guests. "What a disgrace," he muttered to himself, his brows knitting together in frustration. "They're nothing but a bunch of entitled whiners." He tossed his phone onto the desk, but it landed with a soft thud, its screen lighting up again with more notifications. "Richard, are you okay?" asked Lisa, one of the front desk clerks, as she approached him with hesitation. The concern in her voice was palpable, and Richard could feel the eyes of the other staff members on him. "I heard about the Johnsons." "Do I look okay?" he snapped, his voice sharp. "This is all just a massive overreaction. They didn't belong here, and I did what I had to do." Lisa pursed her lips, unsure how to respond. "But they're influential. People are talking. The owner might—" "Don't you dare!" Richard cut her off, slamming his palm against the desk. "This hotel has standards. We can't just cater to everyone who walks through the door. If we did, we'd lose our reputation." Just as he finished his sentence, his phone rang, shattering the tension in the air. The caller ID read, "Mr. Carter, the hotel's owner." Richard's stomach dropped. He answered with a forced calmness, masking the anxiety bubbling within him. "Richard, we need to talk, Mr. Carter's voice boomed through the receiver, firm and unyielding. "I'm hearing disturbing things about your handling of the Johnson family. Care to explain?" Richard swallowed hard, suddenly feeling very small. "I just did what was necessary, sir. They—" "Necessary?" Mr. Carter interrupted, his tone growing colder. "You mean to say you acted based on your prejudices? This family is not just any guests. They're connected. If you don't fix this, you might find yourself out of a job. Do I make myself clear?" Richard's heart raced as he braced himself against the desk, feeling the walls close in around him. "Yes, sir. I'll handle it." "Handle it quickly, Richard. I won't tolerate this kind of scandal." The call ended abruptly, leaving Richard staring at his phone, a mix of anger and dread swelling inside him. As he sat there, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. The Johnsons were not just any family. They were respected philanthropists and had connections that could easily dismantle his career. He had acted out of impulse, letting his biases dictate his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. "Richard?" Lisa's voice broke through his thoughts. "What did he say?" "He wants me to fix this," he replied, his voice hollow. I need to find a way to make it right." "Maybe you could apologize," she suggested tentatively, her eyes wide with concern. "Apologize?" Richard scoffed, shaking his head vehemently. "You think that'll fix everything? They'll just see it as weakness." "They might see it as a step towards understanding," Lisa offered, trying to bridge the gap of his arrogance. Richard leaned back in his chair, contemplating the possibility. But even as he weighed her words, he couldn't shake the feeling of superiority that had always lingered at the back of his mind. Who were they, anyway? Just because they had connections didn't mean they were better than him. Not wanting to dwell on his growing unease, Richard turned his attention back to his phone, scrolling through the myriad of posts condemning him. Each comment felt like a jab to his ego, and he couldn't help but feel the embarrassment burning in his cheeks. Suddenly, a notification caught his eye, a retweet from a prominent journalist who had a substantial following. The tweet read, "The Ritz Royale's treatment of the Johnson family is a reflection of a troubling culture in elite establishments. It's time for change." Richard's heart raced. The media would have a field day. He had to act quickly. "Lisa, can you find out if the Johnsons are still in the city?" he asked, urgency creeping into his voice. "Sure, I can try to reach out," she said, her brow furrowing in concentration. "Do it," he barked, his patience wearing thin, "and make it fast." As she rushed off to gather information, Richard felt a mix of panic and determination. He had to regain control of the situation to spin this narrative back in his favor. He couldn't afford to be seen as the villain in this story. Minutes felt like hours as he waited for Lisa's return. Finally, she burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement. "I found them. They're at a nearby restaurant. I think they're meeting with some friends." "Perfect, I'll go talk to them," Richard said, his voice filled with newfound resolve. "Be careful, Richard. They might not take kindly to you after what happened," she warned, her tone laced with concern. "I can handle it," he replied, a false confidence bolstering his spirits. After all, he was the manager of this prestigious hotel. He had the upper hand, didn't he? As he made his way to the restaurant, Richard rehearsed his speech in his mind. He would apologize, of course, but he would also emphasize the hotel's standards, the reputation that had taken years to build. The Johnsons would understand, he told himself, that maintaining excellence sometimes meant making tough decisions. Arriving at the restaurant, Richard took a deep breath before stepping inside. The ambiance was warm and inviting, but he felt a chill as he scanned the room and spotted the Johnson family at a table in the corner. David and Michelle were engaged in conversation, their children occasionally giggling at something on a nearby phone. Richard approached with a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "Mr. Johnson?" he started, his voice faltering slightly. "Do you have a moment to chat?" David looked up, surprise flashing across his face. "What do you want, Richard?" "I'd like to apologize for what happened at the hotel," Richard said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "I acted impulsively, and I realize now how wrong I was." Michelle's expression remained cautious, while David studied him with a critical eye. "You think an apology is enough?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Richard hesitated, the weight of his previous actions crashing down upon him. "I believe it's a start," he replied, trying to maintain his composure. "But it's not just about you, is it?" David continued, his tone unwavering. "It's about the culture that allows such prejudice to flourish. What are you going to do to change that?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He hadn't anticipated this angle. I'll work on it. I promise," he stammered, feeling the ground shift beneath him. "Your promises don't mean much without action," David said, leaning back in his chair. Richard felt the sting of his words, the truth behind them. Maybe it was time to confront not just the Johnsons, but his own biases and the toxic environment he had fostered. "Look," Richard said finally, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I want to make this right. I want to learn. Please, give me a chance to show you that I can change." The air grew heavy with silence as the Johnsons exchanged glances. "Actions speak louder than words, Richard," Michelle finally said, her voice steady yet compassionate. "We'll consider it, but it's going to take more than an apology to earn our trust." Richard nodded, a sense of humility washing over him. For the first time, he felt the true magnitude of his mistakes and the journey ahead. As he stood there, the world outside seemed to pause, and in that moment he understood. Changing a culture of prejudice required more than just an acknowledgement. It required a commitment to change, to growth, and most importantly, to respect. The hotel lobby buzzed with a frenetic energy, a stark contrast to the silence that had reigned just hours before. Reporters crowded the entrance, their cameras flashing like lightning as they clamored for a glimpse of the Johnson family. The air was thick with indignation and disbelief, a palpable sense of injustice reverberating through the throng of supporters who had gathered to demand accountability. It was a spectacle one Richard Thompson had never anticipated. Richard stood behind the front desk, his hands trembling slightly as he watched the scene unfold. He had always prided himself on maintaining the hotel's elite reputation, but now it felt as though the walls were closing in on him. The buzzing of phones and murmurs of the crowd filled his ears, drowning out any rational thought. "Richard!" a voice called out, slicing through his anxiety. It was Marissa, his assistant, her face pale with concern. "We need to do something. They're not going to leave until they get a statement." He straightened up, attempting to project an air of confidence he didn't feel. "What do you suggest? I can't just walk out there and admit I was wrong." Marissa raised an eyebrow, exasperated. "You might not have a choice. This is beyond just a few angry tweets. It's a full-blown protest." Richard's stomach churned at the thought of being confronted by these reporters, each of whom seemed to have their minds made up about his character. Just then, a tall man with a microphone approached him, his expression a mix of determination and curiosity. "Mr. Thompson, can I get a word with you about the Johnson incident?" the reporter asked, thrusting the microphone closer. Richard's heart raced. "I'd prefer to make a statement later. Right now, we're focusing on ensuring our guests feel safe and respected." The reporter smirked, clearly unimpressed. "And how do you reconcile that with throwing out a family who booked a room at your hotel? What message does that send?" Richard clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling within him. "The hotel has policies, and those policies must be upheld for the integrity of our establishment." "Policies?" the reporter scoffed. "Or prejudices, because that's what it looks like from where we're standing." Before Richard could respond, the crowd erupted into a chorus of shouts and chants, demanding justice for the Johnsons. Their voices swelled, drowning out any semblance of logic or reason. Richard felt cornered, like a deer caught in headlights, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with an unbearable heaviness. Meanwhile, outside the hotel, the Johnson family stood together, united and dignified. David Johnson, the father, adjusted his tie, his demeanor calm despite the chaos that surrounded them. Michelle, his wife, held their children close, offering them a sense of safety in the storm. "Are you ready for this?" David asked, looking at his wife and then at his children, who nodded with determination. "Yes, Dad," Ava replied, her youthful voice brimming with conviction. "We want to make sure everyone knows what really happened." As they stepped forward to address the press, the crowd fell silent, the anticipation palpable. David took a deep breath, his heart racing as he faced the sea of reporters. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady. "We stand before you not just as the Johnson family, but as representatives of a larger issue, one that affects countless individuals who have faced discrimination and bias." Michelle added, "We came to this hotel expecting respect and hospitality, just like any other family. Instead, we were met with hostility and prejudice. This isn't just about us. It's about the values of equality and dignity that we all deserve." Ava stepped forward, her young face earnest. "I'm only 15, but I know that everyone should be treated the same no matter what they look like or where they come from. What happened to us was wrong, and it should never happen again." The reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word, every emotion. In that moment, the Johnsons became more than just a family. They became a symbol of resilience and strength against a backdrop of injustice. Richard, still inside the hotel, felt the weight of their words seep through the walls. He had tried to maintain control, to uphold what he believed were the standards of the hotel, yet here were the Johnsons, standing tall and unwavering, exposing his actions for what they truly were. His heart raced, a mixture of shame and anger coursing through him. "Richard, we need to respond," Marissa urged, her voice tense. "The press is going to tear us apart if we don't take action." He rubbed his temples, feeling the pressure mounting. "What do you want me to say? That I was wrong? That I let my prejudices cloud my judgment?" "Maybe you should," Marissa snapped, her frustration boiling over. "This is bigger than just you. People are hurting, and if you don't acknowledge that, it's going to blow up in your face." Richard felt the truth of her words settle heavily in his gut. He had always viewed the hotel as a business, a place to enforce standards and maintain reputation. But he had forgotten the fundamental principle that a hotel was also a home away from home, a refuge for those seeking comfort and respect. As the Johnsons continued to speak, their words resonating with the crowd, Richard found himself lost in thought. The Johnsons were not just a family, they were a reminder of his own failings, a reflection of the biases he had harbored beneath the surface. The very principles he had fought to uphold had become twisted in his mind, leading to this moment of reckoning. "Richard," Marissa's voice broke through his reverie. "We need to make a statement now." He exhaled sharply, his mind racing. "Fine, I'll go out there." The moment he stepped into the light of the lobby, the noise of the crowd surged back, reporters clamoring for attention. Richard felt his hands clammy, the weight of 100 eyes upon him. "Mr. Thompson, what do you have to say?" one reporter shouted. Richard cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly. "I want to apologize for the events that transpired. It was never my intention to disrespect the Johnson family or anyone else. We strive to create an environment of hospitality for all guests, and I acknowledge that I have failed in that regard." The crowd buzzed with a mix of disbelief and skepticism. Richard pressed on, desperation fueling his words. "I am committed to addressing the issues at hand, to learning from this experience, and to ensuring that our policies reflect the values of respect and inclusivity." "Is that enough?" another reporter challenged. "Or is this just damage control?" Richard felt his heart race, the doubts creeping in again. "I realize that actions speak louder than words. I am willing to work with the Johnsons and the community to foster a more inclusive environment." As he spoke, he caught a glimpse of the Johnsons, their expressions a mix of disbelief and cautious optimism. Richard's heart sank. Would they accept his words, or had he already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? "Thank you," he concluded, stepping back, his chest tight with anxiety. The crowd erupted into a cacophony of questions, but he could barely focus on their words. As he retreated, Richard felt the burden of his choices weighing heavier than ever. The Johnsons stood united outside, their dignity intact, while he faced the unraveling of everything he had once held dear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over New York City, the once bustling lobby of the prestigious hotel had turned into a battleground of whispers and discontent. Richard Thompson stood behind the front desk, his brow furrowed, eyes darting nervously to the entrance as if expecting a wave of disapproving guests to storm in. The hotel's reputation was swiftly plummeting, and the cancellations were pouring in faster than he could process. He felt like a ship on a stormy sea, tossed by the waves of public outrage. "Did you see this?" a young receptionist named Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of the lobby. She held up her phone, displaying a trending hashtag, "Ash Justice for the Johnsons." Richard's stomach sank. The Johnsons, a family he had thought he could dismiss with a wave of his hand, had become symbols of dignity and resilience, while he was painted as the villain in a narrative he had crafted himself. "I don't want to hear it," Richard snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. "Just focus on your duties. We need to maintain some semblance of order here." He turned away, trying to mask the tightness in his chest with a facade of authority, but even he could feel the cracks forming in his carefully constructed world. Meanwhile, outside the hotel, throngs of reporters and supporters had gathered, their voices rising in a crescendo of demands for accountability. Richard could see them through the glass doors, a sea of cameras and protest signs, and he could feel his heart racing. Every flash of the camera felt like a spotlight shining directly on him, illuminating his arrogance and prejudice for the world to see. As he paced back and forth trying to formulate a plan, his phone buzzed relentlessly. It was his mentor, Henry, an older hotelier who had once guided Richard through the intricacies of luxury management. Richard hesitated before answering, knowing that Henry would likely have little patience for his excuses. "Richard," Henry's voice came through the line, steady and authoritative. "I've been following the news. This isn't just a minor hiccup, it's a disaster. You need to take responsibility for your actions." Richard clenched his fists, the frustration boiling over. "I made a decision based on the hotel's standards. They violated policies." "Enough," Henry interrupted. "This is bigger than just you and your policies. You've hurt a family publicly, and now the world is watching. You need to reach out to the Johnsons and apologize." A sincere apology. Richard felt a wave of anger wash over him. Apologize? To them? It felt like admitting defeat, like kneeling before the very people he had wronged. "But what if they refuse? What if they twist my words?" "Then you'll have to face the consequences," Henry said bluntly. "But you owe it to yourself and to the hotel to make amends. You're not just a manager, you're a leader. Show them that you can learn from this." Richard ended the call feeling a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. He knew Henry was right, but admitting his mistakes felt like stripping away his armor. After a long moment of contemplation, He realized that the only way to regain control was to confront the very situation he had tried to avoid. Later that evening, Richard stood in front of the mirror in his office, rehearsing the words he hoped would sound sincere. "I'm sorry," he muttered to his reflection, his voice sounding hollow and unconvincing. "I was wrong to judge you based on your appearance." Each word felt like an effort. A weight hung over him, pressing down on his pride. "Richard," he said to himself, "you can do this." But the self-assurance he desperately sought eluded him. The thought of facing the Johnsons, of seeing them look at him with disdain, made his palms sweat. What if they dismissed him? What if they turned their backs on his apology? The fear of rejection gnawed at him. The following day, Richard made his way to a community event where the Johnsons were scheduled to speak. He arrived early, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation as attendees gathered to hear the Johnson story. Richard felt out of place, an outsider in a space buzzing with hope and unity. As the Johnsons took the stage, Richard's heart raced. David Johnson's voice rang out, calm and composed, as he spoke about the importance of equality and respect in hospitality. Richard listened, captivated, yet terrified. Here was a man whose words carried weight, who had transformed personal hurt into a call for change. "And in the face of adversity, we stand together stronger than ever," David proclaimed, his eyes scanning the audience with confidence. "We must demand better from those in positions of power." Richard felt a pang of guilt wash over him. He had been that person in power, and he had abused that privilege. As the speech continued, he felt small, diminished by the very ideals he had rejected. After the speech, Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He approached the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. The Johnsons were surrounded by supporters, their faces illuminated with admiration. Richard's throat felt tight, but he pressed forward, determined to deliver his apology. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his voice shaky but earnest. David turned to him, eyebrows raised in surprise, and Michelle stood protectively beside him, her expression cautious. "Mr. Thompson," David replied, his tone neutral, masking any hint of emotion. "What brings you here?" Richard swallowed hard, his pride wavering. "I wanted to apologize. I was wrong in how I treated you and your family. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I've come to realize that I need to change." For a moment, silence enveloped them. Richard could see the skepticism in their eyes, the walls they had built in response to his earlier behavior. He continued, "I understand if you don't want to accept my apology, but I truly regret my actions. I want to learn from this and do better." Michelle exchanged a glance with David, her expression softening slightly. "It's a start, Mr. Thompson, but actions speak louder than words," she said, her voice steady. David nodded in agreement. "We appreciate your words, but it's going to take more than that to rebuild trust. You need to show us that you genuinely care about change." Richard felt a rush of emotion, a blend of relief and determination. "I will," he vowed, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to make amends. I want to be part of that change." As he walked away from the stage, Richard felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew the journey ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, he felt hope flickering within him. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could learn to embrace humility and respect, and in doing so transform not only himself but also the environment he had once sought to control. The community event buzzed with anticipation, a vibrant gathering of families, local leaders, and advocates for social justice. Colorful banners hung overhead, celebrating diversity and unity within the city. Richard Thompson could hardly believe he was here, standing amidst the very people he had wronged. His heart raced as he scanned the crowd, searching for the Johnsons. He had rehearsed his apology 1,000 times in his mind, but now, standing in the shadows, he felt small and vulnerable. Finally, he spotted them. The Johnson family was surrounded by supporters, their laughter ringing out like music above the murmur of the crowd. David, tall and dignified, was animatedly discussing something with a group of community leaders. Michelle, graceful and poised, engaged warmly with those around her. Ava, their youngest, with her bright smile, seemed to be the center of attention, effortlessly drawing people in. Marcus stood slightly apart, his expressions a mix of pride and caution as he watched his family. With a deep breath, Richard stepped forward, his palms slick with sweat. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, its rhythm echoing his mounting anxiety. But he had to do this. The stakes were too high, and the implications of his actions weighed heavily on his conscience. He approached them, the crowd parting as he drew closer, apprehension bubbling in his throat. "Excuse me, Johnson family?" Richard's voice trembled slightly, betraying his nerves. The moment he uttered their name, the laughter around them faded into an uneasy silence and all eyes turned to him. David's demeanor shifted immediately, his smile replaced by a guarded expression. "What do you want, Richard?" he asked, the edge in his voice unmistakable. Richard stammered, searching for the right words. "I wanted to apologize for what happened at the hotel. My behavior was inexcusable, and I want to take full responsibility." Ava crossed her arms, her skepticism palpable. "And why should we believe you? You didn't seem to care about us then." "I know," Richard replied, his voice dropping to a sincere tone. "And I regret it deeply. I let my biases cloud my judgment and I treated you unfairly. I'm here to say I'm sorry and to ask for a chance to make things right." The air thickened with tension, and Michelle looked at David, silently gauging his reaction. Richard noticed the exchange, feeling the weight of their unspoken words. "I've learned a lot in the past few days," he continued, desperation creeping into his voice. "I've realized the importance of inclusivity and respect. I can't change what happened, but I want to help advocate for the same values I failed to uphold." David's expression softened slightly, but he remained wary. "Talk is cheap, Richard. You need to show that you mean what you say." Just then, Ava stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "You think an apology is enough? You think you can just come here and fix everything with words?" Her voice was steady and fierce, a contrast to Richard's quivering resolve. Richard swallowed hard, feeling the sting of her words. "No, I don't think that. I know it takes more than words. I'm willing to commit to real change, to work with you in any way you see fit. I want to learn, to understand, and to support efforts that promote inclusivity in hospitality." Ava studied him closely, her expression unreadable. "What if we don't want anything to do with you? What if we want to distance ourselves from that part of the hospitality industry?" Richard felt a pang of despair at her words. "I understand, I wouldn't blame you, but I hope you'll consider it. Change doesn't happen overnight, but I want to be part of that change." As silence enveloped them, Richard felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Just when he thought all hope was lost, Ava spoke again, her voice filled with unexpected enthusiasm. "You know, I've been documenting our experience on social media. I started a campaign about equality in hospitality and it went viral." Richard blinked in surprise, unable to grasp the implications of her revelation. "Viral? What do you mean?" Ava's eyes sparkled as she explained. "People all over the country are sharing our story. They're rallying behind us, calling for accountability and demanding change in the industry. It's become a movement." Richard's heart raced as he processed her words. "A movement?" he echoed, a mix of awe and concern flooding through him. "What does that mean for you and your family?" "It means we're being approached by sponsors and organizations that want to collaborate with us," Ava said, her voice rising with excitement. "We're in talks to launch a charitable initiative promoting inclusivity in hospitality. It's bigger than I ever imagined." David's eyes widened, a sense of pride overtaking the initial skepticism. "That's incredible, Ava," he said, beaming at his daughter. "You've turned this situation into something powerful." Richard felt a wave of emotions crash over him, envy, admiration, and an overwhelming sense of realization. The very family he had dismissed and disrespected was now on the brink of creating a significant impact in the industry. He watched as the Johnsons embraced each other, their bond evident in the way they celebrated Ava's achievement. "I can't believe this," Richard stammered, feeling like an outsider in their moment of triumph. "You're not just changing your own narrative, you're changing the entire industry." Ava turned to him, her expression resolute. "We're not doing this for you, Richard. We're doing it for everyone who has faced discrimination and prejudice. But if you want to be part of it, you need to show that you've changed." "I want to," Richard said earnestly, the sincerity in his voice cutting through the tension. "I want to support you in any way I can. I'll help spread the word, and I'll commit myself to ensuring that your message of inclusivity reaches every corner of the hospitality industry." Ava observed him carefully, her expression softening just a fraction. "Actions speak louder than words, Richard. If you genuinely want to change, then you need to prove it." As the crowd around them began to chatter again, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Johnsons were not just victims, they were champions of change, and he had the opportunity to join them in their mission. He realized that his journey was just beginning, and the lessons learned from this experience would shape the way he carried himself moving forward. "Thank you, Ava," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I'll do everything I can to support you and your family." As the Johnsons turned back to engage with their supporters, Richard felt a shift within himself. He may have started as a prejudiced manager, but perhaps through the Johnsons, he could become a catalyst for change, a lesson he would carry with him forever. The power of community, resilience, and humility had opened his eyes to a world he had long ignored, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt hope.